On today's show, the NBA draft is finally here, and with less than 24 hours to go, we weigh in with some final stuff before the draft. And of course, the Hawks are on the clock technically right now. We'll get into all of that and more coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1749 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Rowland, coming to you on a Tuesday evening into Wednesday. In fact, it is late in the night on this Tuesday into Wednesday. In fact, it's draft day as you're listening to this podcast on Wednesday, June 26th. And today's podcast is brought to you by the folks at FanDuel Sportsbook. This summer, FanDuel is hooking us all up. Yes, all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. Something for everybody every day, all summer long. And the place to go is FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. I also want to tell you at the top of the podcast, as I always do, to make us your first listen each and every day here at Locked On Hawks, please subscribe to the show anywhere you might find podcasts. That includes YouTube, where you can like and subscribe this episode right now as you are watching it, plus Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, etc. And I do appreciate everyone for listening to the show, whether you are an everyday listener or someone jumping on right now for the draft. We definitely appreciate it, and come back in the future. There is much more to come on this podcast, but obviously, we'll be getting into a ton of pre-draft content. Just to timestamp things, I'm recording this podcast, nearing the midnight hour or so as I start this podcast on Tuesday into Wednesday. We'll be done around 12:30, 1 a.m. So keep that in mind. If something happens overnight or first thing in the morning, I will try to update as fast as I possibly can. But there's a reason I'm timestamping. There's lots of stuff going on. Earlier tonight, actually, in the NBA, Mikal Bridges got traded for a massive, massive haul from Brooklyn to New York, for instance. There's another deal involving draft picks that happened. It is fast and furious, and that is the nature of the beast this time of year. With that said, our plan on today's podcast is to dive into the latest intel on the number one overall pick with regard to the Hawks. Then I will give some of my own analysis, kind of those final weigh-ins on the top 3 or 4 guys in this class and what the Hawks are weighing. And then at the end of the show, maybe a final prediction on the draft, as well as some non-number one overall pick intel, reporting, news, etc. That is the plan, and if something changes, we will pivot in a hurry. So we'll start with the number one pick stuff. I should at least plug this. I've been covering this draft for a very long time. I am a big draft person. Even before the Hawks won the lottery, we were doing a lot of draft coverage on this pod. I would have done a lot no matter what, but it's been really busy the last month and a half, 2 months since the lottery. And basically, it's wall to wall. So if you missed anything in the archive, I recommend listening to all of the shows, including stuff from this week. I did a 2-part episode yesterday with my friend Tyler Jones. I had Sam Vecini on the podcast about a week ago, Brian Schroeder, the list goes on and on and on, and lots of draft stuff. But recently, basically, it's been a little bit of a moving target on the number one overall pick. So we'll start here. Brian Windhorst on Monday on the Hoop Collective podcast that he is the host of said the following, quote, "From what I understand, I really don't think the Hawks are taking Donovan Clingan if they stay at number one. I think if they traded back, I think Clingan would certainly be an interesting player for them," end quote. He also said plainly on that podcast that he would be, quote, "surprised by Clingan at number one." From there, Jonathan Givony of ESPN, a prominent mock draft aficionado, intel guy at ESPN, on the Low Post on Monday said the following, quote, "I think if anything but Zach Risacher happens at 1, I think that would be a big surprise around the NBA," end quote. Notably, that quote does leave the door open for a trade. It does not narrow it to the Hawks taking Risacher, but some pretty strong language about Risacher going in the number one spot. That kind of prompted, I think, some push in the betting markets, for instance, as we'll get into in a second. Also, Woj on Tuesday night, as I'm recording this podcast on the TV side on ESPN, said that Risacher is, quote, "prominent in their conversations in Atlanta," end quote, but also said the Hawks have not fully landed on who they're going to take as of, again, earlier tonight on the ESPN broadcast. And in general, this is not an indictment of Givony or anybody else, but Woj's intel is certainly what I would trust probably above most people's intel on this stuff. Not analysis of the draft, because he's not a draft guy, but obviously at this time of year, he's going to have some intel that nobody else has. Also, Woj said that they're not fully in who they're taking, but they're not currently engaged. Again, not currently engaged to move down the board. That does not rule it out, but it is notable that they're not currently in those conversations at this point in time. I was going to do a mock draft update of sorts on the podcast, but basically all of the mainstream intel-based mocks now have Risacher. And when I say that, I mean Bleacher Report and John Wasserman. I mean ESPN and Givony and Jeremy Woo and Sam Vecini at The Athletic, Kristen Peak of Yahoo, etc. They're all at Risacher at this point in time. Now, that does not mean Risacher is a lock. And for reference, my guy Sam Vecini had Clingan a couple days ago at number 1 overall. So it's still a little bit fluid. And as I mentioned before, there's a little bit of uncertainty no matter what. But our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook, who sponsor this podcast, official sports betting partner of this podcast and the Locked On Podcast Network, FanDuel has Risacher as a minus 430 favorite right now as of about midnight Eastern time. That translates into about 81% in implied odds. So obviously likely, but not quite a lock. Clingan is plus 300. Sarr is plus 750. Everyone else is 20-1 or higher. Keep in mind that the odds for number 1 overall are not the odds of the Hawks picking that player. It is number 1 overall odds. So the player that is drafted there could be traded, could be whatever. Keep that in mind. It's about draft slot, not team. All that said, so that's the intel right now. It's been for a couple of days now. I referenced this actually on the show on Sunday morning that I did sort of a bonus episode, that it was kind of coalescing in a lot of people's minds between Risacher and Clingan if the Hawks stuck at 1. That is still kind of the feeling that I'm getting at this point in time. There is this subplot, though, around Alex Sarr that we'll get into right now. So Landry Fields did an interview on Tuesday morning with 92.9 The Game, which is a local station in Atlanta on the radio side. It's actually the flagship of the Hawks, so a lot of Hawks crossovers there. Landry comes on there regularly. Steve Koonin does regularly, etc. That is a natural tie-in. But Landry said that they were, quote, almost there when deciding about number 1 overall, and he also said, quote, I have a pretty good sense of who we'll take, end quote. Obviously, he did not say who that is, nor would he ever say that. But that is also the strongest he has been so far on that question, which is basically what you expect as we get close to the big day. He did acknowledge they've had calls from teams trying to go up, but he would kind of need to be wowed, is the way he put it, by the offers to move down. And he also said, kind of just the way it all connects together in the holistic sense, the number 1 overall pick, there are other roster moves, trades, etc. It is all one big picture. It's not a bunch of silos. Keep that in mind. But the more newsy section of this interview was about Alex Sarr. So it's been reported, I talked about this a lot on the show, that Alex Sarr and his agent, or however how you want to put that, Alex Sarr has not worked out for the Hawks, and there's been some noise about that. Fields said on the record, again, recorded on a broadcast on Tuesday morning, that Sarr was actually scheduled to come work out in Atlanta, and that it was on the books, is the way he put it. And then Sarr's side declined to come to the workout after it was already scheduled on the books. Landry said he's not bothered by that, said it was nothing novel, but something that agents just do, but also an example of why teams have to do their work early and not rely on private workouts. He did not get into detail on what the explanation was from Sarr's side for not coming in, but he also said that Sarr is the only player that they wanted to work out that declined to come work out for the Hawks. None of that is terribly shocking based on the report that's already been out there, but it was more candid than you would normally hear Landry Fields. Sarr, conveniently, was doing press today because today was media day in New York with all the prospects. He got asked about this. I believe it was Bailey Murmaster of CBS here in Atlanta that asked the first question to Alex Sarr, and he gave kind of a non-answer, but he did mention trusting his team around him, including his agents, etc., before kind of circling back to a more standard non-answer. I will say that Landry was more direct in his answers around Sarr than he usually is. That could be tactical. It could not be tactical. It did strike me and some other people that I would say around the league as a little bit surprising, because if the Hawks were going to take Alex Sarr, you'd be surprised if Landry would go on the record and kind of not badmouth, but like it doesn't paint Sarr in the best possible light that they agreed to that they had agreed to come and then that was canceled. Is it that big of a deal? I would argue no, but it is something that you would not normally hear a GM say at the same time. So I'm noting that Jake Fisher did a follow-up interview with Sarr in New York and Sarr talks about how he was basically willing to go play for anybody. He's not going to hold out. That's been out there. I've talked about it before. I'll talk about it again. There's not like a ton of buzz that he just like refuses to go to Atlanta, but there is this like, will they or won't they? Do the Hawks take him? My stance, and I'll say it again right now, has always been, if the Hawks view Alex Sarr as the best prospect in the class, like if they have number 1 on the board, him not working out should not be a deterrent in taking him, in my opinion. I took Alex Sarr in a mock draft for Locked On this week as an example. And I'll get into more of my own evaluations in a second, but that's where I would be on the broad strokes here. I get it. This is not the best look in the world. I understand fans not being happy about this. Sarr, not necessarily admitting it, but Landry was pretty candid about this. So the bad blood there, any of that stuff, it could be water under the bridge in a day or two. It could not be. It could be one of those things that we talk about for years and years and years if Sarr goes somewhere else and blows up. But little bit of drama, and that's where we are right now. And that's all the intel. Again, just to summarize, most people are giving Risacher the lead as far as the most common projection, number one overall, betting market. Windhorst, Gavoni, a little bit of Woj lean there, although he wasn't quite as definitive. And we'll see if Clingan's still in the mix. We'll see if Sarr's in the mix. We'll see if there's a trade. Still a lot of uncertainty compared to normal years. And as a reminder, a year ago, I guess it was 2 years ago now, 2 years ago, there was the Jabari Smith Jr., Paolo Banchero. Everyone thought it was going to be Jabari Smith Jr. And then at the very end, it was Paolo, and it was apparently Paolo all along. It's smokescreen season. So keep that in mind. Always keep your guard up this time of year, and that is especially true at number one overall in a class without a traditional number one overall pick. And speaking of that, we'll get into all of my own evaluations on the top three guys and more in a second. But first, a word from our partners on today's podcast. Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors, and passion driving pages are the form of winning championships. It's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and also level it up to peak performance. They have everything, and I mean everything that you need to dive into with regard to your car, whether it's aesthetic stuff, under the hood, etc., superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and much more. Whether you are into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered across the board. They have over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, and you will always find exactly what you're looking for with the folks at eBay Motors. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back is coming to you. Because with eBay Motors, you are burning rubber and you are not, crucially, burning any cash. With all the price that you need at the price that you want, it's easy to turn that car that you have into the MVP and bring home that win you are happy to be seeking. Keep your ride or die alive right now at ebaymotors.com. One more time, the place to go is ebaymotors.com. eBay Guaranteed Fit will only be able to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Okay, and for a while, I have been talking about these prospects with different guests, trying to let the guests speak a lot, but also injecting my opinion every once in a while on those shows. I have been hearing for a while that there are really only three realistic options if the Hawks stay at one. Again, not ruling anybody out, but there's kind of a consensus of what the Hawks are looking at. And people that have better sources than I do seem to agree that it would be a pretty big surprise if the Hawks stayed at one and drafted someone other than Risacher, Clingan, or Sarr. In fact, Sam Vecini said that on the show about 9-10 days ago at this point in time on this podcast. I am heavily narrowing down to those three with regard to evaluation and discussion on the podcast. Candidly, I would have other guys maybe closer to the mix than others, like Ron Holland, for instance, maybe Steph Castle, maybe Reed Shepherd, as I talked about with Howard Jones on the show earlier this week, especially with Reed, if not for his fit questions with Trae and size stuff. Anyway, I'll mostly focus on the top three guys that I think are in play more for the Hawks. I've said this before, at this point, and still my final board is going to be Alex Sarr at number one overall on my overall big board, but not by a lot, not in his own tier in the way that some around the Hawks might have. I won't do my full scout on every guy on this podcast because it would take too long. I've been talking about those guys for a long time, but the Cliff Notes version is that I really like the defense with Alex Sarr, and I think his overall package of skills, if it works, has the highest overall ceiling of the guys in real contention for the Hawks. He moves really well defensively. He can play any coverage, 9'2" standing reach, 7'4" wingspan. He blocks shots. He has pretty good feel on defense. I think there's definitely an all-defense kind of ceiling for Alex Sarr. On offense, I am less sold for sure, and that is why he's not more of a clear number one or in his own tier. On the positive side, I think I like his touch for a player of his size. I think he has good ball skills for a player of his size. He is comfortable with the ball in his hands in a way that a lot of guys are not at this age and his size. He has some short roll flashes. I think he'll shoot at some point. He's already shooting a little bit now. I think it's going to be a good skill of his compared to a lot of bigs in the future. But there are some questions for sure. He's kind of a work in progress offensively. He's very raw compared to some players at this stage on offense. He's not very strong, which hurts him on both ends of the floor, I would say. Doesn't really play like a center on offense right now. Not a great finisher around the rim, especially given his physical tools. Not been a huge lob threat, not a great pick and roll finisher, etc. If you threw him on an NBA court right now, I think he'd be pretty shaky on offense. That doesn't mean you panic about that. I think it's much more, in my philosophy for a new listener, you're not drafting for rookie seasons. You're drafting for 2 or 3 years from now, especially this high in the draft. But there has to be growth there, and you have to project that growth to draft or value Sarr at the very, very top. But even defensively, where I am quite excited about Alex Sarr, he has to get more physical, rebound better, especially at center. It's part of this. I still really like him quite a bit. I don't have a traditional number one overall pick grade on Sarr, but he is the guy that I would take if you told me that I was forced to pick someone at one in this class and pick the best player available. I would pick Alex Sarr. And there's this debate about his position. I do think that his best position long-term is going to be center. I'm not saying that's the only way it works, but that's kind of what I think. And by the way, I think his camp does not agree with me right now. But as far as a bet on talent, he is the guy I have at number one overall, even if the gap is not huge. And there you go, as far as my short version of my Alex Sarr evaluation. On the other two guys, I personally have Donovan Clingan a bit higher than Zaccharie Risacher, but I do understand having the reverse opinion. Similar to what I just said about Sarr, I'll give you the short version of my thoughts on both guys here. On Clingan, I think his defense and his rim protection in particular are arguably the best bet of any skill set in this class. Maybe you could argue something like Reed Shepherd's shooting being up there as well. That's reasonable for sure. He's a great shooter. But I am extremely confident in Clingan being at least a high-level rim protector and defensive anchor in the NBA. That also helps me to believe, as I've said before on the show, but I'll say now, that Clingan, I think, is the safest prospect, the guy with the highest floor, however you want to put that, in this class. That is not what you're always looking for at number one overall. I would say that, certainly. But there is real value in the confidence that I have and that you're getting with a guy who flat out projects to be really good on one end of the floor and fine, at least, on the other, in my opinion. He is massive. 7'7" wingspan, 9'7" standing reach. That's absolutely huge. He's not a bad athlete at all in space. He's a technician in a good way defensively. He uses his size well. He rebounds well. Great shot blocker, like legitimately great shot blocker, rim protector. The real question is whether he's actually like an uber elite defender, like defensive player of the year candidate, or merely a good one. That is a big distinction, even if both sides are obviously really good. If you think that he's only going to be a quote-unquote good defender, you probably don't love him at number one overall in this draft, I would say. But if you think that there's defensive player of the year stuff in there and projections, it's a much easier sell. So keep that in mind as kind of a differential point potentially. On offense, not going to be a star in my opinion, but I think he's underrated in some circles. He's an excellent screener, which definitely helps. Great finishing numbers at the rim, good touch. I don't love the idea that he's going to be this big perimeter shooter that people have kind of talked about because the free throw numbers are not great, but that's a potential bonus with some flashes and workouts and some natural talent there from a touch perspective. There are questions about his durability, his ability to play big minutes. I get that. He is massive and hasn't played that big of a workload. That's a question, if nothing else. I'm not saying it's a huge concern, but it's something to keep in mind. I understand not loving a guy at the very top of the draft. It's not a huge individual shot creator for himself, but I like Clingan's passing a lot on offense. He's been a hub in college. He worked well there. He plays with really good feel, and I think he's going to be a good player. That's not a ringing endorsement. I promise you that does matter a lot. I believe he's going to be a good NBA player, not a small thing. On Risacher, the selling point there is easy, right? 6'9" wing who can shoot and defend. I've said it before. I'll say it again. 6'9" wing who can shoot and defend. That is the short-term sales pitch. And that's a very good sales pitch. Not to bring in the Mikal Bridges trade, but you could argue if you wanted to squint and do this, that like that's an argument for taking the wing guy because the wing guys usually get overpaid or overvalued or whatever you want to say. There is huge value around the league for guys who can do those things. On the positive side, Risacher shot it really well this year from three. 39% from three on good volume, more than 40% on catch and shoots. He is an active off-ball player. He is he's unselfish. Key distinction there, unselfish. He can attack a closeout. I think he makes really the right pass most of the time. The positives on defense are also there. I think he's especially good off the ball defensively as a team defender. There are some really high-level moments for him defensively on a professional level, playing defense in a way that most guys his age have not had to show or have been able to show. He's shown flashes defending guards. He's a fluid athlete. Good range there defensively. There is some stuff, though, that I'm skeptical or at least questioning of. For one, his stat projections are not great. Admittedly, these are a tough thing to do given his role overseas in Europe. Historically, Kevin Pelton of ESPN, who's a really respected numbers guy, I think he would acknowledge this. Some of the top-tier European prospects have been underrated by his metrics. With that said, Risacher is 55th in this class in the stats-only model for Pelton. That's a little bit scary. For me, he's also not an on-ball player at the NBA level. He is not an on-ball player in my mind. Is it possible that he develops that? I would say yes, but I do have a hard time projecting it a little bit, and I think not the usual pitch for a top 2 or 3 pick in a draft on the wing to not be an on-ball player for the most part. he isn't a great athlete. He's an okay athlete. I would say he's fluid, but not explosive. His finishing at the rim is not very good, I would say, on film, and also in the numbers. For this last season, he had more turnovers than assists. Again, most of that I think is attributable to his role, not necessarily his passing, but not a great data point anyway. He probably isn't going to be a wing stopper defensively. I think he's more of like your second or third defender than your lead defender on the wing, but still, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think he's probably more of a supporting defender, a guy you like on defense, but isn't going to be like a game changer for you on the end of the floor. So the overall concern, if you have one with Risacher, would be that you're getting a guy who might not have a single super fantastic skill. And that's a tough sell at number one overall. With Sarr, you have this potential to be this like hugely valuable defensive piece with his range and all that stuff. With Clingan, it's the defense, obviously. With Risacher, it's a little bit more unclear, but I will say the shooting might be that tool. That is kind of what you have to buy into, I think, to have Risacher at number one is the shooting. I have seen, and I've said this before on the show, but there were some shaky numbers at lower levels from Risacher. He did do a lot of work on his mechanics, and they are much better now. So it's easier to believe it, and he shot the ball well this year. So if that is a real number, and he's a plus shooter, everything else kind of falls into place a lot easier. One of the questions, though, is that I think he flat out needs to be a really good shooter, or the whole package kind of dissipates a little bit. Not that he won't be a good player, but I think if there is upside with Risacher, it's going to need to involve high-level shooting. So I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but it's a big swing for him. Or maybe his defense pops too, but I think it's more of the shooting is much more of his potentially outlier skill in a good way. I do think, though, circle back on this, that the league really values what he could be as far as archetype is concerned, because everyone in the league is looking for big wings who can shoot and who can defend, and he is that. That's pushing him up higher than I think he would be in a normal class for sure. But it's the same curve that everybody else is on. There is no normal number one overall pick in this draft. They don't exist. I understand some might believe that Sarr is that. I had Sarr number one and still think that he would have gone 4, 5, 6 last year in the draft. He's not a usual number one overall pick. That's okay to say. Same for Risacher, same for Clingan. I know it's not sexy, but that's the way it goes. And by the way, a reminder while I'm thinking about this, the Hawks did nothing to go from 10 to 1. They got lucky in the lottery. If any of these guys were at 10, we would have been doing backflips. So the only gap there is paying them more, but it's still a good thing they won the lottery. Just saying that out loud. Anyway, I would say this to wrap up this section of the podcast. I'm open-minded on these three guys. The gaps are not very big at the top of this draft. I firmly believe that. And that is also the consensus, generally speaking, not only my own opinion. Speaking of Vecini, he wrote the following this week, quote, League sources tell The Athletic that it might be difficult for Atlanta to move off the pick, if only because the talent differential among the top 6 or so picks is considered to be minimal, end quote. I agree. It's very narrow at the top. So keep that in mind. I understand that's not the greatest thing for takes or great radio or inspiring disagreements, but there you go. One more thing on this front. I would be more open to trading down than some others would be. And I do understand the risk. I promise I do. I've seen people comparing what the Hawks did with Luka and Trae, for example. That is not an example I would use. For one thing, and I don't mean to go back into this, it's been a long time, but if you listen to the podcast 6 years ago, I had Luka number one in the class by a lot. I said that repeatedly over and over on the show. I wrote it multiple times. I was critical of the decision to trade that pick once he fell to them. But even if you remove any of that stuff away, there is no one in this class but anywhere close to the pre-draft grade of someone like Luka. The gap is not that big. There is still risk in passing on someone like Sarr or Risacher or Clingan, no matter who you think it is. And if that player who goes number one that you trade down out of, and if that player blows up, the PR hit is not good for you. That is the reality. Does that matter? You decide. My personal board, though, is pretty narrow in terms of gaps between players, and especially if the Hawks do not view Sarr as their number one guy, I'd be very open to moving the pick, and probably for less than you would traditionally associate with number one overall pick trades, because, again, last year kind of an outlier with Wemby the other direction, but you are not going to get a typical offer at number one for your usual pick in this draft. Like, it's just that Godfather offer, I don't think it's coming. Keep that in mind. There are trade down options. I'll briefly name some of them. The Hawks worked out a lot of guys from the top 7 or 8 on my board. I think, just broadly speaking, if the Hawks trade down, they are probably, or at least semi-probably trying to get Donovan Clingan in a trade down. They like Donovan Clingan. I'm confident about that. That's not breaking news, but I do believe it's accurate. If the Hawks move down, their number one focus there would be to get Clingan. But if he's not there and it still moved down, it could be Modest Buzelis. It could be Steph Castle. I'd be interested in Ron Holland. I don't know what the Hawks are. If they worked him out. If they traded Trae Young, which I would not do, but if they did, I'd be open to Reed Sheppard for sure. So there are possibilities that if they were to trade down, I still think by a lot, it's either stay at number one or trade down and get Clingan. Everything else would be kind of a surprise to me, but we will see. We will see. We will see. Okay, I will have some more stuff on the non-number one pick buzz in the coming days, as well as the latest news. But first, a word from our partners on today's podcast. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. It sometimes means baseball, basketball, and so much more. And you can bet it all at FanDuel Sportsbook. FanDuel is America's number one sportsbook. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everybody, every day, all summer long. Bet all of your favorite players and teams with quick bets and live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and much more. FanDuel Sportsbook app is easy to use, and they have everything you're looking for in the sports betting space, from over-unders to point spreads to money lines, player props, game props, future bets, and much more. The app is safe. It's secure. They cover the entire range of sports as well. That includes the NBA, and of course the NBA draft. There were prices on that. Bets by slot, bets by team, over-unders, all of that is there for you at FanDuel Sportsbook. Plus the WNBA, NFL, college football, MLB, golf, tennis, soccer, auto racing, boxing, MMA, and so much more. And now is the best time. Sign up with the folks at FanDuel Sportsbook. The place to go is FanDuel.com/lockedon. One more time, just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and start making the most out of your summer with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, one bit of quick news here, and that is that Mike Scotto of Hoops Hype and formerly of The Athletic reported that Ryan Schmidt, who was the Skyhawks coach last year in the G League, is, quote, expected to spend next season as an assistant coach for the Hawks in Atlanta. No surprise at all. I think I talked about this with Glenn Willis on the show earlier this offseason, but that was my expectation the entire way. I think that he did such a good job last year and is really, really highly regarded that if the Hawks didn't promote him, somebody else would have across the league. So he's very well regarded. And this is not a surprise, and we'll see when the official announcement comes. But Ryan Schmidt is a very good coach, and I think he'll be around the team quite a bit moving forward. All right, with that out of the way, there is some buzz about non-number one stuff, and I'll briefly touch on some of that, although none of it is concrete right now. So it had been somewhat quiet around Trae Young, Dejounte Murray, et cetera, compared to the fever pitch that it could be, along with the trade that happened tonight with Mikal Bridges, et cetera. There's a little bit of buzz from Jake Fisher of Yahoo on Tuesday when he wrote that the Hawks are, quote, expected to engage rival teams on trade scenarios for both Trae and Dejounte throughout the offseason, end quote. That isn't new. That's very much been in the ether a lot in recent days. He did say that the Lakers, Pelicans, and Spurs, quote, remain three destinations that would be appealing to Young, end quote. That does not mean Trae's going to be traded. That does not mean that Trae has to be traded. That is theoretical. It's interesting anyway, but keep that in mind. I think it's a tepid market right now for both Trae and Dejounte from what I've heard on some level. Could that change? Absolutely. I think particularly right now, based on what I've heard about what the Hawks might be able to get for Trae Young in a trade, his value to the Hawks is higher than what he would get in a trade, I think, right now from what I've heard. I know there's a big split in the fan base about whether to keep building with Trae, but no matter where you fall on that, I think, or I hope you could agree, that you do not just give Trae Young away for a modest return, particularly, again, with the reality that the Hawks owe 3 straight first-round picks to San Antonio and don't really have easy access to a rebuild. Again, easy is not – it's not impossible, but it's hard to rebuild right now. At least go into a full rebuild. If you're a new listener, I'll do a quick summary about the guard stuff. I do think that breaking them up in a vacuum is the right decision. I think the two players are both very good, Young and Murray, but they don't maximize each other. It has not worked through 2 years. The results have been pretty grim. They don't fit that well together necessarily. I personally do not think that trading Trae Young and building around, quote unquote, Dejounte Murray is something that is really appealing to me. I'm not ruling that out from happening. That could certainly happen in real life. I would not do that. But there is tons of divergent information out there, both publicly and privately, honestly, about whether the Hawks would look to move Trae or Dejounte or neither or both. I still think as far as practical terms is concerned, the most likely outcome for this summer is either one of two things. A, keeping both because they can't find a trade they want to do, or B, trading Dejounte and keeping Trae. I think those are the two more likely outcomes than the other two, which are, of course, trading Trae, keeping Dejounte, or trading both. But it could all change, and it's all possible, I would say. On that front, Shams did report this week that Dejounte is on the Lakers' radar, talking about a level of interest in him over the last several months. We'll chronicle at this point that he was close to a deal with LA back in February. Sam Amick wrote that the Lakers are still interested in Dejounte, but are still trying not to trade Austin Reeves. That was one of the holdups back in February as well. There are other spots that might make sense for Dejounte. I have discussed this in the past quite a bit, but New Orleans has been kind of in the ether the last couple days. A very logical trade partner, whether it's Brandon Ingram or whatever construction. They like Dejounte. I've heard that before. Fresh buzz there, I would say again. I did a lot on the Brandon Ingram saga earlier this offseason. Could be a deal there, but again, nothing imminent that I'm aware of right now. But I would keep an eye on New Orleans and a few more teams. I think you can probably cross off New York. That was a sleeper team. Not anymore after they went out and got Mikal Bridges, but there are teams that are out there that could be interested in Dejounte. And of course, the Hawks are very much open for business, I would say, right now, as far as trades are concerned. Everyone has said this, but I'll say it too. The only guy on the roster that I think it would shock me if he was traded is Jalen Johnson. There are, of course, levels to availability. I always say that. But Jalen is the one guy who I think would be a shock if he was traded. Everybody else, to varying degrees, is available. I won't do the whole luxury tax spiel on the podcast right now, but the Hawks are projected to be over the tax, and they have guys like Clint Capella and DeAndre Hunter that are extremely available and being talked about around the league in trade talks. I think that it gets magnified even more if the Hawks take either Sarr or Clingan at the top of the draft, because I cannot see a scenario in where they keep Capella, Okongwu, and a number one overall pick center on the team. That would be weird, and I would be surprised by that. There was some Capella stuff that I talked about on Sunday on the podcast with some teams tied to him. Add the Thunder to that list that's been reported. They have cap space that could be appealing there. I won't go down that rabbit hole too much. Hunter is trickier with 3 years left in his deal, but those guys are definitely movable. So I could get into the Trae, Dejounte saga, etc., but I'll leave it there for now. I will say this before we get out of here. I'm going to name some guys that I like if the Hawks were, let's just say, to get back in the middle of the first round somehow, either in a trade down or a Murray trade or something, or a Capella trade or a Hunter trade. Just name some guys I like in the draft because people ask me this question. This is the short answer of this because I'm going along on this podcast, but I like Devin Carter. I like Kyle Filipowski from Duke. Obviously, the connection there to recent Duke draft picks, but I like his skill set. Tristan Da Silva, Jacoby Walter, Yves Missy in a scenario where the Hawks trade one of their centers and don't draft Clingan or Sarr. Jaron Holmes, more in the Filipowski combo big mold, but a guy I like. Ryan, I'll do my plug for Ryan Dunn, who is the best defender in the draft. Offensively, big mystery, but I am partial to his defense. The list goes on and on and on. And similar topic, I would say, I got questions about my second round guys. Again, I did a whole show about Ryan, with Brian Schroeder, who was great on the draft earlier this cycle about non-lottery picks. So I recommend listening to that. But some guys that I would like in the second round if the Hawks were to get back in. And again, right now, reminder, they only have one pick. It's number one overall, but it's not hard if they want to get back in the second round. Last year's a good example. They went and got Mo Gay with a pick that was not their own a year ago. That is doable if they want to. Just some names here. Jalen Tyson from Cal, Jamal Shedd from Houston, Oso Ighodaro from Marquette, Trae Alexander from Creighton, Tristan Newton from UConn, Harrison Ingram from UNC, Isaiah Crawford from Louisiana Tech, Justin Edwards from Kentucky, Reese Beekman from Virginia. And honestly, I do think Bronny James is a better prospect than people think, but I wouldn't take him in the top 45. So late in the draft only, and there's a whole different storyline about that. So last thing, before I get out of here, I'm trying to get out of here in a reasonable time period to appease the overlords, but everyone wants a prediction, right? So I'll end with that. I think as of, again, midnight-ish on Tuesday into Wednesday, as I'm recording this, the single most likely outcome in the draft for the Hawks at number one, well, number one is staying at number one and also drafting Risacher. Again, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but the single most likely outcome, I think, as of right now, this moment, is staying there and drafting Risacher. I will say, I am less sure about that based on intel than the betting market is, and less sure, especially, than Jonathan Givony happens to be. So everything I said earlier applies. I still think, again, most likely single thing would be Risacher at number 1, but I am not as confident as some others are about that. Trade stuff, much harder to predict than I won't even try to. And look, nothing is broken or wrong that the Hawks don't make another trade outside of the pick on draft night. It is a deadline of sorts. Deadlines tend to spur action, but still, stuff can happen. And look, the draft, as we've already saw it tonight with the Mikal Bridges deal, stuff is happening around the league, and it's going to keep happening, and we'll have much more coming up, I promise you. Before I sign off, one more final plug. Incredibly deep archive of awesome draft guests, even before the lottery. Tyler Jones this week, Sam Vecini, The Athletic, his podcast partner, Bryce Simon, Brian Schroeder a couple different times, love Brian, Ben Pfeiffer, Andrew Kelly, Ricky O'Donnell, Stone Hansen, Bryce Hendricks, Glenn Willis, Richard Stamen. The list goes on. Awesome stretch. I'm thankful to all of the guests who've been on the podcast and to all of you for listening and watching the podcast. There is much more to come. At the very least, I'll have a new show after the draft on Wednesday when it comes to breaking down what the Hawks actually did, whether picking someone, trading someone, etc. And then I'll have much more after that heading into the weekend. Then there is no break at all. Free agency opens on Sunday. So Summer League's 2 weeks after that. I'll be in Vegas covering that with the Hawks and much more. So please, please, please subscribe, rate, review, like the show on YouTube, tell your friends, tell your family. Buckle up as well for a busy Wednesday. If something happens, I will try my best to do something quick before the draft actually happens, but I will see you at the very latest after the draft on Wednesday evening, and we'll see you all next time.